How's it going, everybody? I wanted to shoot a semi-quick video, at least that's the intention, is to shoot a semi-quick video. I wanted to kind of recap and wrap up the VMware Home Lab deployment of the physical servers part 2. So, you've already seen the rollout of the servers, right? Everything worked out really well. Well, what I'm going to do is I took a bunch of video of all the different steps I went through, and I configured the servers, I got the CIMC set up, so I have a lot of video of those things being configured. The unfortunate part about it is the video, I wasn't paying attention to the video as it was being recorded, and so a lot of it went out of focus. So because the camera picked up the reflection in the monitor that I was zoomed in on, and with me moving around, it messed it up. So a lot of stuff is blurry. So just be aware of those things when you're seeing them. I will try to find some screenshots and insert them as pictures and stuff like that, and I'll use this video as a audio overlay with that. So a couple of things that I had to do in order to get this, some of the issues that I ran into. So the first thing was the LSI software RAID controller that comes built in was not turned on in the BIOS. So I had to go into the BIOS of the servers, and I had to turn, if you go underneath the advanced options, I believe it is, and you go underneath the advanced, and you go down to Southbridge. You go under Southbridge, and then the LSI controller was turned off for whatever reason. So I did that. So I went in there, I enabled that, rebooted the server, and then when I went through and went to allow the server to begin to boot the boot up process, when it went through that process, that's when the ability to affect or to configure the RAID controller became an option. So I went in there, I configured it, and I've got some videos on that I recorded as well, so I'm going to I'll insert those here and there as we're going along. So I went ahead and I got that part done. So I was able to get the 240 gig SSD working on 2 of my 3 servers. So there's the third one, which is you want, like if you remember the first video, the part 1, it's the top server. It's my third one. That one, for whatever reason, I don't understand why, I can't get the 240 gig SSD I can't even, I'm sorry, take that back. I can't even get into the software RAID controller. So right now, the 240 gig SSD won't even show up, right? So it doesn't even work. No harm, no foul. So once I got that good, I was like, all right, cool, awesome. So I figured I was in the clear. So then I already had the USB drive plugged into the back of the server to go ahead and boot to ESXi. Right, so I go through that process, and voila! The first 2 servers, I was able to pull up the SSD, and it was like, all right, cool. Well, I wasn't doing the configuration on one server, learning all the details, noting what they were, and then, okay, here we go. I was being kind of a dork, and I went ahead and I was like, oh, good, we're moving on to the next one. I wasn't validating my config. So I would go through and I go to install ESXi 6.7 on the SSD. I go through, VMware sees it, it goes ahead and deploys, great. I then go to boot from the SSD, I go to the BIOS, SSD's not there. Like, what the heck? So I see the RAID controller show up, I'm like, okay, well, I'll just boot to that. It boots right into the EFI shell. Like, what the heck? So I'm not sure what to do at this point. So the next thing I did was I have 2 other C220 M3s deployed, and I have them configured with spinning disks, so the mechanical hard drives. So what do? I go buy more hard drives. Another $100, get the new hard drives in, I physically go in. The servers won't even boot past the RAID controller. So I'm like, take like 2 steps forward, or take 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Like, what the heck is going on here? So I'm like, now I'm a week in to this deployment, and I'm pulling up my hair. So in this video, or this particular clip, I went ahead and I went through the process of getting the Cisco Integrated Management Controller, or the CIMC, CIMC as it's commonly referred to. I went ahead and started getting it configured. I used a different IP addressing scheme further on down the road, and I'll talk about why I made some changes towards the end of the video. and things like that. But I'm going to go ahead and just play, and I'll kind of fast forward through the video a little bit to try to help break down what's going on. I've eliminated the audio, so I'll just play the video piece of it so you guys can see what's happening. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually scoot forward here. The problem I ran into was I was running into an issue where the reflection on the screen here was happening a lot, and so that was causing the focus on the camera to go in and out a lot. So that's why I figured I would just quickly run through this. So when you first go through and you boot the server up, you go through this initial boot up process. So that's me talking about how I'm going to go power it on. So I literally just press the power button. The server comes online, it boots up, and then you'll drop into it's doing a memory test here, is what this shows up as. And there's an actual IP address that's been mapped here. So it's going to go through and do some initial memory tests, and then once this gets past this, it'll go ahead and reboot. It usually does this a couple times. It does it the first time, and then it reboots, and then it immediately will drop into the configuration menu. So once the configuration menu is dropped in, I'll go ahead and fast forward this a little bit just so we can get to that point. Here I'm going to go ahead, and what you see is these menu options. So you can press F2 to enter the setup, F6 to enter the boot menu, F7 for diagnostics. I pressed F8 to do the CIMC boot up, and then you can see the 10.255.10.184. Because the port that this server was connected to was attached to a switch port that was in a VLAN that supports DHCP, it went ahead and got an IP address. So I went ahead and I entered the CIMC config. The CIMC config is you press F8, and what you do is you go through, and I'll go ahead and I'll annotate this as we're going along. So I went through, I went ahead and switched it from a, what was that, just a second ago, from a shared LOM EXT, whatever that stands for, and I went ahead and I spacebarred so that it would be a dedicated mode. I did that, and then I was able to arrow down to where the configuration was set up. I turned DHCP off, and I went ahead and I configured the IP addressing to be an IP address that I would give it so that I'd be able to access it. So I went through all that process, got that all squared away, changed the default gateway config around. Then I made sure that went up here to NIC redundancy. I made sure to go over here to none and press the spacebar to select none. Then you press F10 to save it, and then if you press F5 a bunch of times, eventually it'll go through and show you what's happening, and then the network settings were configured, so you were good to go there. So then it goes ahead and it reboots. So let me go ahead and fast forward through this. So now it reboots, and we run into this problem where it was having focusing issues. So now we're configured. Now I went ahead and I pressed the F6 menu, and the reason why I did the F6 was so that I could enter the boot menu. So the boot menu is entered, and then I got this. Well, I had already gone through and taken a 32 gig or 16 gig USB drive, and I had installed used Rufus, which is this guy right here. Rufus allows you to take a USB drive and make it a bootable USB drive, and I was going to install ESXi with that, and that's when I ran into this problem. It was like, okay, you can't do this because it's trying to boot into UEFI mode. It wouldn't work. So I ended up having to go back to the computer, my desktop, and redo it, but switch the partition scheme to MBR for master boot record. I did that, and I thought there might be some other option around here. I went to enter setup so I could change the boot order, and if we come in here, if you look right here where it says Southbridge, this is where I actually needed to go because the 240 gig SSD that was physically inserted into the server wasn't showing up later on when I detected it. So here we're making sure that all the capabilities need to be turned on and everything's looking good from there. And you can see here we're in the boot options. I'm looking for the 240 gig SSD. It's not there. We have the UEFI shell, we have the two network adapters, and then we have my SanDisk Cruiser 16 gig USB drive. That's all it's being seen there. So that was the problem there. So as you can see, I was trying to get this to be the top option so it would boot up into the USB drive. So that was the case in point there. And then when I went to go, this is just showing you where that would have come into play. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the next video and go from there. Alright, so what ended up happening was I took the USB drive, I went ahead and I reformatted it to be an MBR to deploy ESXi on, and I went ahead and here we can see that we are getting ESXi 6.7 update 1 to go ahead and be detected through the boot up menu, which is what we want. So I went through that process and it started to do the ESXi install, and if we let me just fast forward here a little bit, notice I had focus issues this entire time, so this stuff is kind of irrelevant. So I was waiting for that to happen. I'm talking a little bit about the configuration there, trying to get the cabling squared away. And here you have the enter key. You press enter to start the installation process. And then I did that. I pressed F11 to accept it, and then I went a little further along. It's scanning. It finds a 16 gig USB drive, but you'll notice that there's no other local disk. It's just this one right here. And this was a problem at the time, and it didn't trigger in my head at the moment. I was just happy to see this pop up. So if you continue a little further along, I go ahead and I hit the enter key. I say yes, I will go ahead, and there's a problem. So I've got nowhere. So I noticed that there's no place to install the there's no place to install ESXi. So because there's no place to install it, I had to cancel it. So I needed to find the 240 gig SSD in order to install it on. Well, I go ahead and I go a little bit further ahead, and I'm looking for the drive, right? I mean, I can't find anything. So, it just goes into this boot loop. So this is a problem. So I ended up finding out by just monkeying around inside of here, I finally realized that there was something turned off. So I went ahead and I went underneath Southbridge. If we look right here, I go underneath, let me back up just a touch. If you go underneath, let me actually back this up just a little bit more for you. If you go underneath Advanced, then you'll get the Southbridge configuration, which is where this is. And when I found this right here was set to disabled. So I needed to enable it so that the LSI software RAID controller would be available. So I went ahead and I said, okay, let's do that. So the next thing would be to go through that process, and then I rebooted. And when you do this and you get a little further past, then you get it's hard to see what it is, but you get the two network adapters, and then this is the Mega RAID software RAID controller. So, and then here we have, so I wanted to configure, and then I just went ahead and went through the process. It took me a little bit to figure out, what the process was, but eventually it found the 240 gig SSD that I had bought for the server, and I went through and set up a new connection, got it all squared away, and then I went through the same process again. And here we have, I'm doing the ESXi install, we're going through that process, everything's looking pretty good, and then the 240 gig SSD shows up. So I have my SanDisk Cruiser, I have my 16 gig USB drive, and I have my 240 gig SSD. So I'm like, okay, cool. So I go ahead and I go through this process, and as soon as I get done with that, I go to reboot, and I'm like, okay, what the heck? So I go in and I reboot it, and then I want to go into the boot options, and the SSD is not there. It doesn't show up in the boot options. So it won't even boot to the SSD that I just installed to. So normally I'm like, well, what the heck? So I'm at this time here, I'm kind of like, I'm frustrated, and I'm looking for it. Now I'm just like turning things on and off to see what options I have, and I'm really frustrated with the whole capability. It doesn't see the SSD at all from the RAID adapter, and now I get into this, and I'm trying to figure out how to get outside the shell. So basically, Control, Delete, and reboot at this point, because I need to have the drive that I want to boot from show up in the boot option so I can boot from it. Okay, so I eventually went back underneath the RAID controller and I set the drive to be the boot drive, right? I'm figuring, okay, this is going down the right direction. So I'm going through this process. I go to the boot drive, making sure everything's good, making sure that the virtual drive is installed and initialize it, that whole bit. going through all those steps, making sure that's all squared away. Then I go to boot, and it says that the drive is online, but the crazy thing about it is when you go into the RAID controller and you got that part set up, what ended up happening was when you would install ESXi to the SSD and then reboot and try to find the boot drive again, it was not available. I felt like I was hitting a bug. And here we look in here, we see the embedded RAID controller, but we don't have the SSD. And that's a problem. You need the SSD to go through that whole process. I'm not seeing it anywhere. So I'm actually really frustrated at this point. So at this point in time, I'm like, can't find, it says it's online, and I'm running into all kinds of problems. And in the process of doing all this, the switch that I was going to use as my lab ESXi switch, this is it. It died on me. So I was like, really? Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. So I had to go online and I had to go buy a new, I think it was like $100 for a new 3750 gigabit switch. This guy died on me. And that's just the inside of it. I tried to open it up to see if there was anything in here that I could do, and it was pretty much, I was looking for a loose connection or maybe a loose screw, something like that, and no, there was nothing there. So I was dead in the water at that point. So because of that, I ended up having to go and get think of another way of doing things. So long story short, I know Cisco has a capability known as Flex Flash, which basically takes an SD card, and there is a controller in the middle of the server. So if you were to, I'll try to find a picture because I didn't record this, but if you look at the top of a C220 M3, if you're looking at the top half of the server, if you're looking at it, would be the top right-hand side would be your power supplies. The top left-hand side would be a bunch of PCIe expansion slots. So if you want to put a daughter card in there for doing, like a RAID controller, or if you want to add in more network adapters, that type of stuff would go right there. Now, in between those two, there is a long piece of metal, and at the very end of that metal, it's kind of subtle, it's not very obvious, there's actually a little SD card controller in there. And on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side of it, you can insert an SD card. I was like, huh. I saw that. I knew about that from a previous deployment of C220s, so I was already aware of that. So I go and I have a 4 gig PNY SD card laying around. So oh, good. So I run downstairs, I plug it in, invalid flash size. So too small, effectively, when I did a Google search. So I go on to Amazon, I buy 3 32 gig SD cards for 20 bucks. To wait a couple days for it to come in the mail via Amazon, and I plug it in, I pull up the CIMC of the server, and boom, it's right there. And I'll show you that in the video. I'll show you where the Cisco Flex Flash comes into play. So I have the 32 gig SD card in there, and it comes in as the controller known as HV. I'm not exactly sure what that stands for, but I went ahead and I was like, awesome! So I've got HV now. So I go into the BIOS, and boom, HV shows up. I'm like, things are looking promising. Until I go to boot ESXi, right? So I have this, I affected the boot selection, so ESXi would be booted up first. The 32 gig SD card is detected. Like, awesome! Some shows up like 29 gigs or something like that. So I click on, I go through all the steps, and then I get an error warning, and I'm like, it says that you can't install outside of the disk. And I'm like, huh? So another Google search. Come to find out that you can't take the SD cards that I bought. Now I'm not sure if this is across the board. The SD cards that I bought, they came pre-formatted, right? With I think the FAT32 file system, which is really, really old. So I was like, well, let's try with NTFS. Well, my dumbass decides to format it with the wrong file system again. I try it again. Like, maybe I should get rid of the file system. So I came back to my computer and I removed the volume. So basically it's just a raw 32 gig hard drive. I plug it back in, boom, pops right up, because it's got to get formatted with its own file system. Now I'm thinking, alright, cool. Now I can go ahead and move to the next step, which is I booted ESXi, I reinstalled installed the hypervisor to the SD card, and boom, it booted up. I have loading VMware hypervisor. I was like, happy dance. So I did that to the other 3 servers. So I go back to the RAID controller on my 3rd server, which is the top one in the previous video, and I still can't get the RAID controller to launch to go into it so that I can go ahead and try to get the 240 gig SSD to show up in the config. So I'm like, it is what it is. I'm not going to sit here and try to like figure out why all the details aren't working. I might not be able to do vSAN in a physical environment. No harm, no foul. I can always rebrand storage as flash if I need to. So I'm going to try to plug it into a different port. Maybe the port's bad. Maybe the adapter on the back of the controller is bad. I don't know. But anyway, that's basically where I'm at right now. So the servers are all up and running. So the next big issue that you run into with the C220s, or I believe it's the M3 and older, if you have an M4 and newer, it's not that big of a deal because the host upgrade utility that you need to use, that in and of itself gets you into a HTML5 based operation, and I'll show you what that looks like here as well. Actually, I'll just go ahead and plug in the IP address 10.1.1.2. Actually, no, not that one. Let's do 10.1.0.2. If you connect to this, this will get you to the, this is a C240 M4, and you get into a different look and feel. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. This is a HTML5, so this allows me to log in to the CIMC via an HTML5 user interface, which is what you'll need to be using when it comes to the deployment of the solution down the road. This is for 4.1 for the 240 and the M4, where this right here is a 220 M3. So as you can see here, I've got this little wonderful thing. So you can click on here and it'll take you to Flash, but guess what? Flashes out is no longer available. So you can come up here and you can say, you know, go ahead and allow it and whatnot. Sometimes you can get it to work, but Firefox, Google Chrome, so on and so forth, they all have this issue with the connectivity of getting into the CIMC and doing anything with it. It's very, very difficult to manage a Cisco UCS server without having the CIMC. So what you have to do is, I ended up finding a workaround called Pale Moon. It's a different web browser, and I found that it works out pretty well. So what you do is you download Pale Moon. And this is an older PC that has an older version of Flash. I'm actually using Flash version 23 here. So if I was to come in here and type in admin and then the password that I had assigned to it, I'll be able to log into the CIMC through Pale Moon. I found a workaround for it. Took a little bit of Googling, but I eventually found it. These are some older servers that I have as well. And so these are part of the new one. So when you get into this setup here, when you come over and get everything squared away, whoops, let me go ahead and bring this guy up here. So this is one of the 3 servers that I got. Some of the CIMCs, some of the KVM consoles work great, some of them don't work at all. So it's kind of a hit or miss. So the part that was difficult was this part right here, was getting through all the steps. We talk about how we need to validate the server itself. So I ended up using the C220 M3 Flex Flash SD card configuration. So what I ended up doing basically was going through, and if you log in here, you can click on storage. You have right here about middle of the server, you have this right here is the power supply. Over here is some places where you can add in daughter cards and a RAID controller and things like that. Right here in the middle, you have this SD card, which is what this guy is here. You can actually have 2 of them. You can have one right here and then one right here. So you can actually have two 16 gig SD cards. You can put them into a RAID and make them one 16 gig SD card to where you can install things from. And once you do, if you come over here to storage, you have the Flex Flash controller. So here it is, it's connected, it's working. If I go to physical info, I can see that this is a 32 gig SD card. And if I go to the virtual drive info, I have a single, it's HV, which I'm not really sure what that stands for. But the nice thing about it is when you go through and have it configured, it'll then show up in the boot menu, and it'll also show up inside of the, when you go to install ESXi, it's there. So if we come over here and we go to the BIOS, we can see the actual boot order is HV. If you expand it, you can see it's SD card. So we know it's there. So I had to go to an SD card in order to get this guy up and running. It took a little bit of time to get it to work, obviously, but eventually it worked itself out. So that's basically where we are. So I'm a happy camper with all of that type of stuff. So I wanted to throw a couple of videos into this process because it took like 2 weeks to get this thing all squared away and figured out. So I'm in good shape now. Everything's up, the servers are operational, and I'm planning on doing a whole bunch of VMware related videos where we'll take a look at the data center virtualization stuff with ESXi, we take a look at NSX, NSXV, NSXT, and then desktop mobility and VDI, all that type of stuff. I'm planning on kind of doing a deep dive. I wanted physical servers to play around with. Guess what? Now I have them. So I'm a happy camper. So that is it for that. And I am currently good to go with all of that. I'm going to do my best to try to interlace the other videos with this one. So that is pretty much it. So I wanted to thank you guys for hanging out with me. I'm going to be I'm working currently on NSX. I've got some stuff rolled out. I've got NSX deployed. I got 6.4.9 rolled out. I have the cluster controller laid out. I've got one because it's a lab. And then I've got VXLAN TEPs, the VTEPs, the VXLAN tunnel endpoints. I've got them deployed to each one of the ESXi hosts. So things are looking positive right now for me. So I'm going to be spending probably a couple of weeks going through and testing all the NSX stuff that I can and all that good stuff that goes along with it. So at any rate, that's basically where I am at with my forward progress on my lab. I'm definitely going to be doing some NSX content in the near future, but it's going to take a little bit of time to get all that stuff. Obviously, I have to do a little bit more of a deep dive. That and desktop mobility. I'll be probably doing that in the next few weeks as well. As soon as I get NSX good and it's operational, I'm going to do DTM. I was running into a problem with getting the Horizon View, or the View events, I think it is, and I had to deploy a SQL server. So I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time figuring out how to deploy SQL server and get the management studio to connect to it, and then deploy a database, and then pull the database in so the Horizon can send the events to the database and all that type of stuff. So that's my current goal right now. So cool stuff. Home labs are always a little bit of a challenge because you run into problems like this, but for every challenge that I'm faced with, it requires me to be an engineer and figure it out. Go Google it. There's no one that's going to do it for me, so I had to do it myself. So I had to figure it out, but that makes me that much stronger. That makes me that much better. So if you guys have any questions, leave a comment in the comment section below. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch all of you in the next video.